July 25, 1943. RAF Bomber Command Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett stands in the operations room, staring at the preliminary loss reports from the previous night's Hamburg raid. His hands rest flat on the mahogany table, knuckles white. This cannot be accurate. No bomber stream survives a defended target with losses this low. The numbers contradict everything Bennett knows about strategic bombing over the Reich. Of 791 four-engine bombers that attacked Hamburg 12 hours earlier, only 12 failed to return. 12! A loss rate of 1.5%. The typical attrition rate for deep penetration raids into Germany hovers between 5 and 7%. On particularly brutal nights, it climbs to 10% or higher. But 1.5%? Bennett reads the intelligence annexes. Luftwaffe night fighter squadrons scrambled as expected. The Kammhuber Line, Germany's sophisticated chain of radar-directed air defense zones stretching from Denmark to France, activated fully. Flak batteries fired tens of thousands of rounds. Every element of Germany's formidable air defense system engaged the bomber stream. Yet the bombers flew through it almost untouched. The explanation lies in what the aircraft dropped alongside their high explosives and incendiaries. Millions of strips of aluminum foil, each one precisely 26 centimeters. 5 centimeters long and 2 centimeters wide. The British called it window. The Germans would soon have another name for it. The weapon that made their most advanced technology worthless overnight. What Bennett and RAF Bomber Command had unleashed over Hamburg wasn't just a bombing raid. It was a demonstration that in modern warfare, the side that controls the electromagnetic spectrum controls the battlefield. And on the night of July 24, 1943, Germany's control vanished in a blizzard of aluminum chaff. The journey to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, though its roots stretched back to the fundamental physics of radar itself. Britain's chain-home radar network, operational by 1939, proved its worth during the Battle of Britain by detecting incoming Luftwaffe formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. But radar's strengths created vulnerabilities. The technology worked by transmitting radio waves and analyzing their reflections. Any object that reflected those waves created a return signal on the cathode ray tube displays, including objects much smaller than aircraft. Dr. Joan Curran, a physicist working at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, understood this principle intimately. In April 1942, she conducted a series of experiments demonstrating that strips of aluminum foil, cut to half the wavelength of a radar's operating frequency, reflected radio waves with remarkable efficiency. A single strip created a radar return comparable to a small aircraft. Thousands of strips created returns that overwhelmed every receiver and display in range. The mathematics were elegant. German Würzburg radar operated at approximately 53 centimeters wavelength. Strips cut to 26.5 centimeters, half that wavelength, achieved resonant reflection, maximizing their radar cross-section despite weighing less than 5 grams each. A Lancaster bomber carrying a full bomb load could accommodate bundles containing 2 million strips, taking up less space than a single 500-pound bomb. Curran's April 1942 memo to British military intelligence outlined not just the technology, but its implications. Window could blind enemy radar completely. It could be manufactured for pennies per thousand strips using ordinary aluminum foil. It required no specialized equipment to deploy. Crews could simply push bundles out of the aircraft flare chutes at predetermined intervals. The entire German air defense system, into which the Reich had poured hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks, could be neutralized by what amounted to industrial waste. But the memo also contained a warning. If Britain deployed Window, Germany would capture samples within hours. German engineers would analyze the strips, understand the principle, and begin their own production within weeks. The Luftwaffe could then use it against Britain's radar network, potentially enabling unrestricted bombing of British cities. This warning triggered one of the most contentious debates in the British War Cabinet. For 14 months, window existed as a proven technology that could save hundreds of bomber crews, locked away by fear of retaliation. Fighter Command argued vehemently against deployment. The technology that could protect bombers over Hamburg could expose London to the renewed Blitz. Lord Cherwell, Churchill's scientific advisor, commissioned studies attempting to quantify the trade-off. If window saved 20 bombers per raid, but enabled the Luftwaffe to destroy 2,000 additional tons of British industry, was it worthwhile? The calculations grew increasingly complex, factoring in production rates, crew training timelines, and strategic priorities. The stalemate broke in June 1943 when three factors converged. First, Bomber Command's losses over the Ruhr reached unsustainable levels, 196 aircraft in May alone. Second, intelligence indicated Germany had already developed their own version, called Doppel, but wasn't deploying it for the same reasons Britain held back window. Third, by mid-1943, Britain's night fighter force relied more on airborne interception radar than ground-based systems, reducing vulnerability to German countermeasures. On July 15, 1943, the War Cabinet authorized window's operational use. The target would be Hamburg, Germany's second-largest city and primary U-boat construction center. The operation received the biblical codename Gomorrah. Hamburg represented Germany's most heavily defended target outside Berlin. The Kammhuber Line's density reached its peak in the approaches to the city, with overlapping coverage from 17 Würzburg radar stations and 8 Freya early warning radars. Luftwaffe Nachtjagdgeschwader 3 operated from 4 nearby airfields, fielding over 60 Bf-110 and Ju-88 night fighters. Flak batteries ringed the city, 54 heavy batteries mounting 264 guns of 88 mm or larger, plus 26 light batteries with 212 additional guns. No RAF raid on Hamburg before July 1943 achieved loss rates below 4%. Most exceeded 6%. The defenses worked with mechanical precision. Freya radars detected bomber streams at ranges up to 120 kilometers. Würzburg stations tracked individual aircraft, vectoring night fighters to interception positions. A bomber crossing the Kammhuber Line faced 3 sequential defense zones, each with dedicated fighters directed by ground controllers watching glowing dots move across plotting tables. German fighter pilots called the system Himmelbett, literally canopy bed, referring to the protective coverage it provided. By early 1943, Luftwaffe night fighters claimed an average of 4.3 bomber kills per 100 interceptions. The mathematics favored Germany. RAF Bomber Command could not sustain the attrition rates the Kammhuber Line imposed. But the line's sophistication created brittleness. It depended entirely on accurate radar tracking. Würzburg stations needed clear returns to calculate bomber altitudes, speeds, and headings for fighter vectoring. The system tolerated minimal noise or interference. Its precision made it vulnerable to precisely calibrated countermeasures. The night of July 24, 1943, would expose that vulnerability completely. Operation Gomorrah's first wave departed English airfields beginning at 21:45 hours. The 791 bombers, 474 Lancasters, 246 Halifaxes, 125 Stirlings, and 73 Wellingtons formed a bomber stream approximately 200 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. The stream flew northeast across the North Sea, crossing the German coast near Cuxhaven at approximately 0050 hours on July 25. Standard procedure, standard route. Nothing suggested the next hour would rewrite the tactical manual for strategic bombing. At precisely 1 a.m., bomber crews throughout the stream began deploying window. Each aircraft carried 2,200 bundles, each bundle containing approximately 2,000 strips. Crews dropped one bundle per minute through their flare chutes. The strips dispersed in the aircraft's slipstream, creating a cloud of radar-reflective material that descended slowly through the night air. Within 3 minutes, German radar operators from Cuxhaven to Schleswig-Holstein reported identical observations. Their screens, which moments before displayed clearly defined aircraft tracks, suddenly showed hundreds of returns, then thousands. The individual returns merged into a solid mass of light. Operators described their screens as covered in snow, completely white, or looking at a snowstorm. Target tracking became impossible. Altitude determination failed. The carefully orchestrated Himmelbett system collapsed. Luftwaffe fighter controllers attempted to vector night fighters toward the bomber stream using dead reckoning and visual searchlight cooperation. But without radar guidance, interception rates plummeted. Fighter pilots found themselves flying through a sky that appeared empty to their radar sets, but full of bombers their eyes couldn't locate in the darkness. The bomber stream reached Hamburg at 0130 hours. Pathfinder aircraft marked the aiming points with colored target indicators. Main force bombers released 2,284 tons of ordnance in 50 minutes, roughly 60% high explosive and 40% incendiaries. The bombing destroyed 1,500 residential buildings, killed 1,500 civilians, and left 100,000 homeless. But the strategic victory wasn't in the destruction delivered, it was in the destruction avoided. Of 791 bombers, only 12 failed to return, a loss rate of 1.5%. German night fighters claimed 8 confirmed kills. Flak accounted for 3 more. 1 crashed on takeoff. The expected casualties of 35 to 45 aircraft never materialized. RAF aircrews returned to debriefing sessions reporting minimal flak accuracy, few fighter contacts, and an eerie sense that Germany's defenses had simply stopped working. They had no idea their aluminum strips had achieved what thousands of tons of bombs could not. They had blinded the Luftwaffe. But by the morning of July 25, 1943, the tactical picture began to change from Germany's perspective, though the full implications took days to crystallize. General Lieutenant Josef Kammhuber, commander of 12 Flieger Corps and architect of the defensive line bearing his name, received the first reports at 0230 hours while the raid was still in progress. His initial reaction combined disbelief and growing horror. Every radar station from Denmark to northern France reported identical symptoms. The Würzburg network, Germany's primary tactical air defense sensor, had been rendered completely ineffective in under 20 minutes. At 6 o'clock hours on July 25th, Luftwaffe technicians at Stade Airfield near Hamburg recovered several intact window strips from a crashed Lancaster's debris field. The strips measured exactly 27 centimeters long and 2 centimeters wide, dimensions that seemed random until a signals officer familiar with radar physics performed a quick calculation. The Würzburg operated at 53-centimeter wavelength. The strips were cut to almost precisely half that length. The implications detonated through Luftwaffe High Command like an intellectual bomb. The British had weaponized basic physics. Resonant reflection, a principle understood by every radar engineer, had been turned against Germany's most sophisticated defensive system. And the weapon required nothing more than aluminum foil and scissors. Oberst Victor von Lossberg, Chief of Staff for Luftflotte 3, examined the captured strips personally. His technical background enabled him to grasp the full scope of the disaster immediately. In a report dated July 26, he wrote, "The enemy has demonstrated mastery of the electromagnetic spectrum that renders our current defensive arrangements obsolete. We must assume they can produce these materials in unlimited quantities at negligible cost. We possess no immediate countermeasure. German fighter pilots reported their experiences with bitter frustration. Hauptmann Wilhelm Janin of NJG-1, flying a Bf-110 G4 equipped with Liechtenstein BC radar, described his interception attempts the night of July 24th. "My radar display showed returns everywhere. Hundreds of aircraft all around us at every altitude. But when we turned toward a contact, there was nothing. Empty sky. We flew through the bomber stream blind, relying on eyes that couldn't penetrate the darkness and searchlights that couldn't find targets. We were hunters suddenly made deaf and blind." The British decision to withhold window for 14 months suddenly made tactical sense. They had known Germany would immediately copy the technology. The question was whether Germany could develop effective countermeasures before their air defenses completely collapsed. By July 27th, 3 days after the first Hamburg raid, German researchers at the Telefunken laboratory in Berlin began crash development programs. They pursued multiple approaches simultaneously. One team worked on pulse Doppler radar systems that could distinguish between moving aircraft and descending chaff. Another investigated narrower beam widths to reduce the amount of chaff illuminated per radar scan. A third explored frequency hopping techniques to prevent resonant reflection. But all these solutions required months or years of development. In the immediate term, the Luftwaffe improvised desperately. They instructed night fighter pilots to ignore their radar sets and rely on visual acquisition aided by searchlights and flares. They attempted to use the window clouds themselves as indicators of the bomber stream's approximate location. They deployed fighters in free-roaming wild-boar, Wilde-Sau formations that patrolled bomber routes waiting for visual contacts. None of these adaptations restored the Kammhuber Line's previous effectiveness. The systematic, radar-guided interception system that had claimed 4.3 kills per 100 sorties throughout early 1943 degraded to approximately 1.8 kills per 100 sorties in August. Germany's air defense network hadn't been damaged by bombs. It had been neutralized by information denial. The British pressed their advantage ruthlessly. Hamburg endured 3 more major raids between July 27th and August 3rd as part of Operation Gomorrah. The raids dropped approximately 9,000 tons of ordnance, killed an estimated 42,600 civilians, and destroyed 250,000 homes. The July 27-28 raid created a firestorm, a meteorological phenomenon where concentrated fires generate hurricane-force winds that feed the flames. Temperatures in the firestorm exceeded 800 degrees Celsius. The conflagration consumed 8 square miles of the city center. But from a tactical air warfare perspective, the Hamburg firestorm served primarily as tragic context for the central story. Window worked. It worked completely, repeatably, and at negligible cost. RAF Bomber Command's loss rates across all 4 Hamburg raids averaged 2.2%. Pre-window rates for comparable raids exceeded 6%. The technology saved an estimated 100 to 150 bomber crews in the Hamburg operation alone. The tactical revolution window represented extended beyond simple casualty reduction. It fundamentally altered the strategic bombing campaign's mathematics. Previously, Bomber Command faced a grim actuarial reality. Bomber crews had approximately a 44% probability of completing a 30-mission tour. Window improved those odds substantially. More importantly, it enabled sustained operations against heavily defended targets that were previously prohibitive in terms of casualties. The development of Window and Germany's failure to deploy their equivalent Duple first illuminated fundamentally different approaches to technological advantage in warfare. British development of radar countermeasures began in late 1937, almost immediately after the chain home network became operational. The Air Ministry established a committee specifically tasked with identifying vulnerabilities in Britain's own radar systems, operating under the reasonable assumption that any weakness discoverable by British scientists would eventually be discovered by enemy scientists. Dr. Robert Cockburn, head of the Countermeasures Division at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, articulated the philosophy in a February 1940 memo. Our objective is not merely to develop radar superior to the enemy's, but to ensure we understand our own system's vulnerabilities better than the enemy understands them. If we can identify a method to blind our radar, we must assume the enemy will eventually develop the same method. Our advantage lies in developing the countermeasure first and the countermeasure before deploying it. This philosophy led directly to Windows development. Joan Curran's April 1942 experiments proved the concept worked. But British military leadership faced the strategic dilemma. Deploying Windows would immediately reveal the technique to Germany, potentially enabling Luftwaffe raids that British defenses, also radar-dependent, might struggle to repel. The mathematics of the decision were brutally complex. Fighter Command calculated that German use of chaff against Britain's radar network could reduce RAF night fighter effectiveness by approximately 40%. In early 1942, when the Luftwaffe still possessed approximately 250 bombers capable of reaching Britain, that reduction could enable significant additional damage to British industrial and civilian targets. Bomber Command countered with equally stark calculations. Without Windows, loss rates over Germany averaged 5.8% per mission. A typical bomber crew faced 30 missions to complete a tour. The cumulative probability of surviving 30 missions at 5.8% loss per mission was approximately 16%. If Windows reduced losses to even 3% per mission, survival probability improved to 40%. The technology could save hundreds of crews. Lord Cherwell attempted to synthesize these competing calculations into a single recommendation for Churchill. His analysis, completed in November 1942, concluded, "The question reduces to whether we value our bomber crews' lives more than the potential damage to British industry from enhanced German raids. The answer should be yes. Our bomber production exceeds Germany's by a factor of 3. Our crew training pipeline exceeds theirs by similar margins. The exchange favors us even if Germany achieves temporary advantage through chaff deployment against our defenses." But Churchill hesitated. The political dimension complicated purely military calculations. If Windows enabled a renewed blitz that killed thousands of British civilians, the government's decision to knowingly provide Germany the means would become politically explosive. The delay stretched from November 1942 through June 1943, 8 months during which approximately 1,400 RAF bomber crewmen died in aircraft that Windows might have saved. The decision to finally authorize deployment stemmed from 3 developments. First, Bomber Command's losses in the spring 1943 Ruhr campaign reached unsustainable levels. Second, captured Luftwaffe equipment in North Africa included unexploded chaff canisters, proving Germany had already developed Duple but chose not to deploy it, likely for the same reasons Britain held back Windows. Third, British night fighters had largely transitioned from ground-directed interception to airborne radar-guided attacks, reducing vulnerability to chaff countermeasures. On June 23, 1943, the Defense Committee Operations authorized Windows deployment against Hamburg in late July. The authorization included several conditions. Bomber Command would deploy it only against German targets, never over occupied territories where intact samples might fall into German hands prematurely. Intelligence would monitor German countermeasures closely to assess whether double deployment against Britain appeared imminent. Fighter Command would prepare emergency procedures for radar-denied interception operations in case of German retaliation. The decision reflected a distinctly British approach to technological warfare. Develop countermeasures before deploying capabilities. Wargame all consequences thoroughly, accept calculated risks only after exhaustive analysis. It stood in stark contrast to Germany's approach to similar decisions. German development of Doppel followed a parallel timeline. Telefunken researchers demonstrated Chaff's effectiveness against Würzburg radar in February 1942, almost simultaneously with Curran's British experiments. The similarity wasn't coincidental. Both stemmed from fundamental radar physics that any competent engineer could derive. But German military leadership faced the mirror image of Britain's dilemma. Deploying Doppel would reveal the technique to Britain, potentially blinding Germany's offensive radar systems, the airborne radars that guided Luftwaffe bombers to British targets. In early 1942, when Germany still contemplated resumed strategic bombing of Britain, that consideration carried weight. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, ordered Doppel production suspended in March 1942. His reasoning, documented in Luftwaffe staff meeting minutes, reflected concern about compromising offensive capabilities. We possess insufficient intelligence regarding British radar development to assess their ability to deploy similar countermeasures against our systems. Until we achieve confidence in this area, weapons that potentially compromise our technological advantage will not be fielded. The decision revealed a crucial difference in strategic perspective. Britain accepted that window would be copied and prepared countermeasures before deploying it. Germany feared Doppel would be copied and therefore refused to deploy it at all. Britain planned 3 moves ahead. Germany attempted to freeze the board. By July 1943, Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where offensive bombing of Britain had become irrelevant. The Luftwaffe's bomber force had been decimated in Russia and the Mediterranean. Yet Göring's March 1942 order remained in effect. Doppel sat in warehouses, fully manufactured, while RAF bomber streams devastated German cities under Windows protection. German officers later described this failure as symptomatic of broader Luftwaffe dysfunction. General Major Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We possessed the defensive weapon but lacked the institutional courage to use it. The fear that Britain might copy it blinded us to the reality that Britain had already developed it independently. By the time we recognized this, they had deployed it first and seized the initiative. Our caution became paralysis." The systematic impact of Window on the air war over Germany unfolded through the summer and fall of 1943 with mathematical precision. Operation Gomorrah against Hamburg demonstrated Window's effectiveness beyond doubt. But Hamburg was a coastal target, relatively easy to locate and attack. The critical test came when Bomber Command employed Window against targets deep in Germany's industrial heartland. On August 17–18, 1943, 596 RAF bombers attacked the V-2 rocket research facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. The raid deployed Window throughout. German night fighters shot down 40 aircraft, a 6.7% loss rate, significantly higher than Hamburg's 1.5%. But Peenemünde represented a small, isolated target requiring precise navigation, and the attack occurred during a full moon that aided German visual interception. More importantly, the raid destroyed critical research facilities and killed several key scientists, setting the V-2 program back an estimated 6 months. Without Window's protection, the raid might have been canceled as too costly against such heavily defended objectives. The pattern continued through late 1943. On August 23–24, 727 bombers struck Berlin, deploying Window continuously. Losses totaled 56 aircraft, 7.9%, but Berlin represented the most heavily defended target in Europe, with fighter concentrations and flak density exceeding any other city. Pre-Window raids on Berlin typically suffered 8 to 10% losses. Window reduced casualties even against maximum defenses. The mathematics of attrition told the story most clearly. In the 6 months before window deployment, January-June 1943, RAF Bomber Command flew 19,619 sorties against German targets and lost 1,047 aircraft, a loss rate of 5.34%. In the 6 months after window deployment, July-December 1943, the command flew 26,536 sorties and lost 1,201 aircraft, a loss rate of 4.53%. The reduction seemed modest in percentage terms, but represented profound tactical shifts. The lower loss rate enabled increased sortie rates, which delivered more ordnance to German targets while actually reducing cumulative casualties. Put another way, window allowed Bomber Command to fly 35% more sorties while losing only 15% more aircraft in absolute numbers. The exchange ratio shifted dramatically in Britain's favor. German attempts to counter window evolved through several phases, none fully successful. The initial response involved wild boar tactics, day fighter aircraft operating at night without radar, attempting visual interceptions over burning cities where the fires provided illumination. Luftwaffe Major Hajo Hermann developed the tactic in June 1943, and it achieved limited success in July and August. But wild war required clear weather and operated with significant limitations. Pilots couldn't distinguish between Allied bombers and German night fighters visually, leading to multiple friendly fire incidents. The tactic's effectiveness declined as autumn weather reduced visibility. More sophisticated responses took months to develop. The first German pulse Doppler radar system, designed to discriminate between moving aircraft and descending chaff, entered limited testing in November 1943, but wasn't ready for operational deployment until March 1944. By then, Bomber Command had adapted its tactics again, varying window deployment rates and introducing false bomber streams to deceive German defenses, even when they could partially filter chaff returns. The consequences extended beyond tactical air operations. Window's success influenced Allied planning for the eventual invasion of France. If radar countermeasures could blind German air defenses so effectively, could similar techniques confuse German coastal radar networks monitoring for invasion fleets? This question led directly to Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer on D-Day, elaborate deception operations where ships and aircraft deployed window in patterns simulating invasion fleets approaching Pas-de-Calais, convincing German commanders the Normandy landings were a feint. But the most profound consequence involved Germany's strategic resource allocation. The Kammhuber Line had represented an enormous investment. Thousands of personnel, hundreds of radar stations, dedicated fighter units, comprehensive communication networks. Window rendered a significant portion of that investment obsolete overnight. Germany faced a choice: accept reduced air defense effectiveness or divert substantial resources to developing and deploying countermeasures. They chose the latter at a time when Germany could least afford such diversions. Development programs for improved radar systems, new fire control systems, better night fighter equipment, all consumed engineering talent, manufacturing capacity, and raw materials increasingly scarce by late 1943. The resources spent attempting to restore the Kammhuber Line's effectiveness might otherwise have gone to fighter production, flak ammunition, or other defensive priorities. Allied bombing killed an estimated 305,000 German civilians and wounded 780,000 more during the war. Window didn't cause those deaths, bombs and fires did. But window enabled the bombing campaign to continue at intensity and scale that would have been prohibitively costly without it. Every mission flown under window's protection was a mission that might have been canceled or scaled back due to expected casualties. Every bomber crew that survived, because German radar couldn't vector fighters to their position, was a crew available for subsequent missions. The technology's strategic impact also manifested in German morale and civil defense calculations. By late 1943, German civilians understood that the Luftwaffe's night fighter force could no longer guarantee their protection. The psychological impact of that realization, combined with the physical destruction of repeated raids, contributed to declining industrial productivity and deteriorating homefront morale. Window didn't break German civilian morale alone, but it helped break the perception that German defenses could prevent the bombing. Perhaps the most bitter irony involved Duppel, Germany's version of Window, which finally received authorization for operational use in October 1943, 3 months after Britain deployed Window. But by October 1943, the Luftwaffe's bomber force had been reduced to approximately 90 aircraft capable of reaching Britain, operating under severe fuel and munitions constraints. Duppel saw limited use against British defenses, achieving negligible strategic impact because the German bomber campaign had already collapsed for reasons unrelated to radar countermeasures. Germany had developed the technology first, hesitated to deploy it, watched Britain deploy an identical technology with devastating effectiveness, and then finally deployed their own version when circumstances had rendered it strategically meaningless. The sequence captured in miniature Germany's broader technological failures during the war. Excellent engineering undermined by poor strategic judgment and institutional paralysis. Window's production statistics reflected the technology's elegance and economy. Britain manufactured approximately 1.5 billion individual chaff strips between July 1943 and May 1945. The total production cost averaged approximately £50 per ton of aluminum foil processed into strips, roughly £75,000 for the entire war's production. By comparison, a single Lancaster bomber cost approximately £58,000. Window's total production cost equaled roughly 1.3 Lancaster bombers, yet the technology arguably saved hundreds of aircraft. The British produced Window in several variants, optimized for different German radar frequencies. The original Hamburg variant, cut to 26.5 centimeters to counter Würzburg radar, remained standard throughout the war. A shorter variant, approximately 15 centimeters long, targeted German Liechtenstein airborne intercept radar. A longer variant, roughly 75 centimeters, countered Freya early warning radar. Specialized teams analyzed captured German equipment continuously, adjusting Window specifications to maintain effectiveness against evolving defenses. Distribution of Window production among RAF bomber squadrons followed established procedures. Each aircraft typically carried 2,200 bundles, weighing approximately 180 pounds total, equivalent to a single 250-pound bomb's weight. Standard doctrine called for releasing 1 bundle per minute during penetration of defended airspace, though tactics varied based on mission profile and expected defenses. Loss rate statistics demonstrated Window's sustained effectiveness. RAF Bomber Command's overall loss rate from July 1943 through April 1945 averaged 3.8% per sortie, significantly lower than the 5.3% average for January-June 1943. This reduction occurred despite Germany deploying improved radar systems, increased flak concentrations, and jet fighters in 1944-1945. Without Window's protection, the loss rates would certainly have climbed above pre-July 1943 levels given the enhanced German defenses. Crew casualty figures reflected the human dimension of these statistics. Approximately 55,573 RAF Bomber Command aircrew died during World War II. Of these, approximately 38,000 deaths occurred before July 1943, roughly 68% of total casualties in 51% of the operational timeline. The post-Window period saw 17,573 deaths in 49% of the timeline. While multiple factors influenced this distribution, improved aircraft, better tactics, reduced German fighter effectiveness due to fuel shortages, Window unquestionably contributed to the improved survival rates. Survivor testimony from bomber crews consistently credited Window with their survival. Flight Lieutenant Donald Falgate, Lancaster pilot with No. 207 Squadron, flew 32 missions between August 1943 and February 1944. In post-war interviews, he stated, "We understood Window made Jerry's radar useless. Every mission, we watched the bundles tumble out the chute and knew we'd just made ourselves invisible." You can't quantify how that felt, knowing the fighters hunting us were flying blind. I had mates who died in early '43 before Window. I've always believed I survived because Joan Curran figured out how to cut aluminum foil the right length. Germany eventually deployed countermeasures that partially restored radar effectiveness. The Fug 218 Neptun radar, introduced in early 1944, incorporated rudimentary filtering that could distinguish aircraft returns from chaff clouds under ideal conditions. The SN2 radar system, operating on longer wavelengths, less susceptible to resonant reflection from standard window strips, became operational in mid-1944. But these systems entered service too late and in too small quantities to reverse Window's strategic impact. By mid-1944, Germany faced multiple crises: fuel shortages, pilot attrition, collapsing air defense networks that no amount of improved radar technology could address. Comparative analysis between British and German countermeasure development illuminated divergent strategic approaches. Britain developed Window in April 1942, withheld it for 14 months while preparing countermeasures, deployed it in July 1943, and had partial technical solutions to German Doppel ready within weeks of its October 1943 introduction. Germany developed Doppel in February 1942, withheld it indefinitely due to deployment concerns, watched Britain deploy Window first, scrambled to develop countermeasures reactively, and deployed Doppel 3 months later when strategic circumstances had rendered it largely meaningless. The philosophical difference reduced to institutional culture and strategic vision. Britain's approach reflected confidence that technological advantage derived from innovation tempo, the speed with which new capabilities and counter-capabilities could be developed and deployed. Germany's approach reflected belief that technological advantage derived from maintaining secrets, the assumption that concealing capabilities provided more value than deploying them. History vindicated the British approach decisively. Window's deployment didn't just save bomber crews and enable expanded operations, it forced Germany into reactive defensive posture, diverting resources to countermeasure development at a time when offensive technologies might have served better. It demonstrated that in electronic warfare, the side willing to innovate openly and quickly typically defeats the side attempting to preserve technological secrets defensively. July 26, 1943. RAF Bomber Command Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett reviews the loss reports from Operation Gomorrah's second Hamburg raid, completed hours earlier. His hands rest flat on the same mahogany table, but this time his posture reflects satisfaction rather than disbelief. 9 aircraft lost from 787 dispatched, a loss rate of 1.1%. The numbers confirm what the first raid suggested. Window works. It works consistently. Germany's vaunted air defense network, the Kammhuber Line, the Würzburg radar stations, the night fighter force that claimed nearly 2,000 RAF bombers in 1942-1943, has been neutralized by aluminum foil. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years. Germany would develop countermeasures, deploy improved radar systems, adapt tactics. But the fundamental equation of the strategic bombing campaign had shifted permanently. Never again would German radar-directed defenses achieve the effectiveness they demonstrated before July 24, 1943. The aluminum strips that made Germany blind represented more than clever physics or innovative engineering. They embodied a philosophical approach to technological warfare that prioritized innovation tempo over capability hoarding. Britain accepted that window would be copied, prepared countermeasures in advance, and deployed the technology anyway because the immediate tactical advantage outweighed long-term concerns about retaliation. Germany's failure to deploy Doppel first, despite developing it simultaneously, revealed institutional paralysis born from risk aversion. The Luftwaffe possessed a war-winning defensive technology and refused to use it for fear the enemy might copy it, never considering that the enemy had already developed it independently. In modern electronic warfare doctrine, Window's legacy persists through concepts like expendable countermeasures, electromagnetic spectrum dominance, and sensor denial. Every radar jammer, every missile defense chaff cartridge, every electronic warfare pod on military aircraft traces intellectual lineage to Joan Curran's April 1942 experiments with aluminum foil strips. The lesson transcends World War II's specific context. In technological competition, whether military or civilian, the advantage belongs not to those who develop capabilities first, but to those who deploy them effectively first. Secrets have value, but that value diminishes as soon as the enemy develops equivalent capabilities independently. And in fields governed by fundamental physics, independent discovery becomes inevitable. Window succeeded because Britain understood this principle. Germany failed because they didn't. The aluminum strips that blinded Germany's radar weren't classified technology stolen through espionage. They were the practical application of physics equations any competent engineer could derive. Britain's advantage stemmed not from knowing what Germany didn't know, but from having the institutional courage to deploy it first, despite the risks. The examination of Window's impact reveals a truth that extends far beyond July 1943. In warfare, and particularly in technological warfare, controlling information matters more than controlling terrain. The side that can see while denying the enemy vision holds overwhelming advantage, regardless of relative force sizes or equipment quality. Window gave RAF Bomber Command that advantage for a critical period when the air war's outcome hung in balance. 42,600 German civilians died in Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah. The firestorm of July 27-28 remains one of history's deadliest air raids. But from a military technology perspective, those deaths represented the consequence of Germany's radar network failure more than RAF Bomber Command's bombing accuracy. The bombers reached Hamburg because Window blinded the defenses. They survived to bomb again because those same blind defenses couldn't locate them for interception. The aluminum strips that made Germany blind weren't a wonder weapon. They were something more dangerous to an adversary, a simple solution to a complex problem, deployable at scale, impossible to counter immediately, and inevitable once deployed because the underlying physics couldn't be unlearned. Window proved that sometimes the most devastating military innovations aren't the most sophisticated. Sometimes they're just pieces of aluminum foil, cut to exactly the right length, dropped at exactly the right time by commanders willing to accept calculated risks for decisive advantage. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why technological excellence without strategic courage leads to defeat, while strategic courage, supported by adequate technology, leads to victory.